systemic control. And we're asking this: is the manipulation of human destiny primarily achieved through the, let's say, silent, long-term pre-programming of inherited biological vulnerability, or is it more about the active, real-time engineering of psychological reality using technology and, well, weaponized information?
Right, and that really forces us to look at whether our fate is fundamentally set by a kind of structural injury passed down, through generations, a wound we inherit, or if we're actually being continuously hacked and redirected right now in the present moment by a control architecture that's constantly adapting. It's really that tension, isn't it, between biological fate and immediate manufactured subversion.
And I'll be arguing that predictable dysfunction and compliance, too, are really rooted in the systemic imposition of environmental stress. Stress that epigenetically corrupts future generations, essentially setting a biological and behavioral baseline that systems like AI can then easily predict and administer.
Okay. And I'll argue that while, yes, those foundational vulnerabilities absolutely exist, the operative control mechanism today, the one with the real teeth, is the ongoing psychological subversion and the, digital steering of consciousness. And that escape, if there is one, requires a really active, high-variety counter-strategy, something that floods the system with a complexity it just can't process.
Okay, but my position is that the deepest form of control, the most fundamental, is structural and biological. It operates across generations. When we talk about control on this scale, we're really talking about ensuring a predictable population distribution. One that's suitable for different tiers of compliance, different kinds of labor. And the system, I argue, achieves this by systemically applying environmental stress.
Okay, but how does that environmental stress actually translate into predictable outcomes? What's the mechanism there?
Well, it's through what we're increasingly understanding as epigenetic corruption. Now, this isn't about changing the DNA sequence itself, right? It's about changing how genes are expressed. Think of it like the environment, flipping genetic switches on or off, making the organism inherently vulnerable in specific ways. We have some pretty stark data, like from the Dutch hunger winter famine. It provides a clear data set. Severe starvation in pregnant mothers led to significantly increased rates of things like diabetes, hypertension, even schizophrenia in their children's offspring years later.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond extreme events, think about systemic sorting mechanisms. Things like creating specific refugee environments or designing urban districts with chronic low resources, ghettoization, if you will. These actions strongly influence the expression of behavioral traits. Sometimes people analyze these through analogies, like the RK selection theory in mammals, which looks at traits related to resource allocation and reproductive strategies.
So you're suggesting that the actual environment of, say, a ghetto or a long-term refugee camp functionally pre-programs a person's path, their likely trajectory, maybe even before they're conceived?
It creates a foundational vulnerability, yes, one that is then very easily managed administratively. This inherited biological vulnerability becomes a kind of structural scaffold for control, and this injury, this vulnerability, is then sorted, often using crude tools like race and socioeconomic status as the primary administrative categorization. It's how people get assigned to low-opportunity tracks. This ensures that inequality isn't an accident. It's a predictable, functional outcome of the control architecture itself. So yeah, the path is largely set by biology and bureaucracy long before the individual even thinks they're making a free choice.
Okay, I see the logic there, but I come at it from a different way. While I absolutely agree that biological baseline creates a susceptibility, a kind of terrain, the operative, immediate power of control today lies in the meticulous, active manipulation of reality and consciousness. The system doesn't just passively wait for inherited traits to, manifest over decades. It is actively engaged in programming the mind right now.
But wouldn't someone like Bezmenov, with his framework of ideological subversion, that slow, multi-decade process, wouldn't that still reinforce your idea of a long-term structural injury being primary?
Bezmenov's work is crucial, yes, but what he showed was that the demoralization stage, that 15 to 20-year process, must systematically erode the critical faculty. It renders people, in his words, unable to assess true information. Modern technology takes that process and accelerates it into real-time reality hacking. We're no longer treated as sovereign individuals, but converted into dividuals, statistical aggregates, predictable units through pervasive surveillance systems like, say, Gorgon stare. Then, we're algorithmically steered by manufactured outrage, by constant stimulus, which fragments our focus. It suppresses the sustained group consciousness you'd actually need for any kind of meaningful resistance. The goal seems to be the creation of weaponized chaos, designed to enforce a perpetual, reactive, short-term mindset. It's about actively manipulating the present moment, which feels far more immediate, far more powerful than just waiting for generational epigenetic drift to play out.
Okay, but that predictability you mentioned earlier, the one stemming from epigenetic stress, that is precisely what the, let's call it the invisible government, leverages to optimize its digital control systems. If systemic stress reliably programs a population for specific health issues, specific psychological susceptibilities, maybe higher anxiety, maybe more impulsive behaviors, often associated with those high-stress environments you described, then AI systems, things like Palantir, they ingest these massive data points on these individuals to perform incredibly advanced analytics.
So the AI is using the inherited biological data, the outcomes of that stress, to manage the present.
Exactly. That's the core of it. This grants the control system predictive capabilities, the ability to anticipate unrest, dissent, even individual actions, potentially years before they occur. It essentially creates a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy based on statistical probability and that structural sorting I mentioned. So, the ultimate control is achieved by combining those structural sorting mechanisms where things like race and money act as the primary scapegoat function, right? Diverting resentment away from the actual systemic issues of capitalism and administrative control, combining that with unfeeling, automated AI prediction based on the biologically compromised state of the population. The structural injury is structural, and the control mechanism becomes primarily administrative, powered by prediction.
That's a compelling argument regarding prediction. I grant you that. But I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the primary control is passive prediction. Look, prediction is only really necessary when you don't fully control the inputs. The system, as I see it, actively manufactures the narratives to ensure control over the outcomes. It operates less like a weather forecast, predicting what might happen based on existing conditions, and more like a real-time reality engineer, actively shaping the conditions themselves.
Okay. So what's the most immediate evidence you see of that kind of reality engineering in action? Well, think about the Paul Benowitz case. It's a classic. Intelligence agencies apparently use the UFO narrative, which you could call a perfect weaponized hyperstition, to deliberately divert him from things he was actually detecting, things that were likely classified military technology tests. Now, hyperstition, in this sense, isn't just a belief. It's a fiction designed to actively manifest as reality, to become real in its effects, and ultimately to consume its targets. They didn't just predict his inquiry, they actively created a false reality designed specifically to discredit him and neutralize his investigation. This deliberate engineering of, let's say, collective forgetting or false memory insertion, which, by the way, studies suggest is disturbingly easy to do, feels much more immediate and powerful than just relying on generational inheritance patterns.
It's like the Patinke Ultra, or even the more mundane data collection we see now with consumer tech. You know, the helpful AI assistants listening in, the constant focus on manufactured conflicts, be it political divisions, maybe UFOs, financial panics. It feels designed to keep the population busy, chasing its own tail, while the real infrastructure of control remains largely invisible. And if an AI is blamed for spreading misinformation or causing chaos, well, that's much cleaner than another Benowitz situation, isn't it? It adds a layer of plausible deniability.
I see why you emphasize that active subversion. It's definitely happening. But let's flip it. If the system fundamentally demands low-variety labor compliance, predictable behavior, fitting into boxes, And it pathologizes the nonlinear, high-variety hunter mindset. The individual who thrives in chaos, seeks constant novelty, jumps between interests. If the system labels that as chaotic or dysfunctional, often through administrative tags like ADHD, then the very resistance you propose seems, well, statistically doomed.
You're suggesting that resistance through high variety, through massive output, is essentially futile because the system will just absorb or contain it?
It contains it by devaluing it. The system can easily deploy what some call the slop defense. Just flood the channels with so much noise, so much low-quality, often AI-generated content, that genuine high-output art or intellectual production gets drowned out, labeled as worthless, part of the noise. This induces something called vomicillin. Now, for listeners, vomicillin is this really specific, gut-wrenching psychological realization of one's own statistical redundancy. It's that sudden wave of nausea when you realize a machine, or just an optimized, automated system, can replicate or even surpass your unique contribution effortlessly, or make it seem indistinguishable from junk. So the moment you try to, as you put it, push the art pedal to the floor, the system simply floods the zone with automated slop that makes your genuine output effectively irrelevant, statistically speaking.
That assumes the system's attenuation mechanisms, its ways of dampening signal, are unbreakable. I'm not convinced. The hunter mindset's strength lies precisely in its ability to excel in high-stimulus, rapidly changing environments, which is exactly the kind of environment the control architecture creates through its weaponized chaos. The goal of flooding the zone of this cognitive proliferation isn't necessarily about seeking validation or avoiding bomutilin. It's about creating requisite variety.
Requisite variety? Explain that.
Yeah. Stafford Beer, in his cybernetics work back in the day, he pointed out something crucial. For any control system to effectively manage a situation, its own internal variety, its complexity, must be equal to or greater than the variety of the situation it's trying to control. Now, government administrative models, corporate control systems, they are often incredibly slow, responding based on data that might be, as Beer noted, half an economic cycle old. So, by accelerating output, by driving every AI app, every platform to its absolute limit with novel data, complex thoughts, unpredictable ideas, we potentially create more complexity, more variety than those outdated rigid models can actually handle. This forces the existing structure, the one demanding that predictable farmer mindset conformity, to either adapt radically or potentially collapse under the sheer data load, the complexity overload. Maybe the only way to survive this acceleration is, well, to go full blast right through it. Force the system itself to evolve beyond its current capacity for simple prediction and control. Like some of the cyberpunks, maybe even land in the CCRU in a way we're hinting at. The only way out is through, faster.
So we've explored two really powerful, yet quite distinct vectors of control that seem to be emerging from the material we're looking at. My position has really highlighted the silent, long-term architectural control, the kind rooted in a biological fate, largely determined by inherited epigenetic vulnerabilities that arise from systemic stress, and how AI potentially leverages this for predictive administrative control, which suggests that, deep systemic structural reform is probably a prerequisite for any kind of genuine freedom.
Right, and I've emphasized the more immediate reality hacking aspect, the active, ongoing manipulation, arguing that maybe true resistance requires something more radical, an acceleration of high-variety output designed to overload the system's current capacity for digital and psychological control. So the essential question, it seems, remains. Are we fundamentally victims of a kind of structural fate, a biological inheritance that necessitates long-term, patient change? Or are we primarily subjects of a manufactured reality, one that perhaps can only be countered by radical, complex acts of cognitive proliferation right now?
There is certainly more to explore in the material regarding the precise threshold where that biological vulnerability perhaps ends and the active psychological subversion truly takes over. And, crucially, whether the hunter's path, that radical acceleration you describe, ultimately creates an agent of genuine resistance, or perhaps just a more sophisticated, maybe even more compliant, subject for future co-option by an even smarter system.